The cards aren't just printed, they're etched with faces, their hollow eyes staring back at me. They're the players who lost, their final screams trapped in the ink like a warning I can't escape. Every time I touch the deck, I feel their despair clawing at my soul, begging me not to join them. The attic was suffocating. Dust particles floated in the dim light, slicing through cracked wooden slats. My grandmother's house was a relic of forgotten times, her attic a tomb of memories I had no business disturbing. Each creak of the floorboards sounded like a warning, but I had to push on. That's when I saw it tucked beneath an old quilt stained yellow with age, a small wooden box. It wasn't like the other items scattered around. The carvings on its surface seemed alive, the intricate symbols shifting whenever I moved my head. A chill crept over me as I knelt to touch it. The wood was strangely warm, almost like flesh, and I yanked my hand back instinctively. But the pull of curiosity was stronger. My fingers found the latch and flipped it open. Inside was a deck of cards. They weren't ordinary. The faded faces bore outlines of human figures, faint and blurred, like something glimpsed through fogged glass. One card stood out, a woman's face, her mouth stretched into an eternal scream. I swear I saw her eyes move, locking onto mine. The attic grew cold, unnaturally so, and then I felt it. A whisper against my neck, soft and breathy, as if someone was right behind me. My heart pounded as I spun around, but nothing was there. The box slammed shut on its own. My legs refused to stay still any longer, and I bolted. I left the attic in chaos, but I didn't care. That night, as I lay in bed trying to convince myself it was nothing, I saw it again. The box was on my nightstand, its lid slightly ajar, daring me to open it once more. I should have thrown the box out the window, but something about it wouldn't let me. Every time I looked away, it seemed closer. It wasn't just curiosity, it was compulsion. I opened it again, this time more cautiously. Beneath the deck was a fragile, yellowed parchment, with words scrawled in faded ink. Once begun, the game cannot end. The cards decide your fate. Refuse to play, and the game will play you. I laughed nervously, hoping this was some elaborate joke. But my laughter died in my throat. When the cards shifted on their own, they fanned out into a perfect arc, as though waiting. My hands trembled as I reached for one. Before I could pick it, a single card slid out of the deck, face down. The whispering began again, louder this time, surrounding me like a swarm of invisible voices. I hesitated, but something deep inside me, a mix of fear and curiosity, forced me to turn it over. The image was clear and horrifying, a house engulfed in roaring flames. But not just any house, my childhood home. The longer I stared, the more the flames seemed to flicker and move, as if alive. My breath caught as I realized the whispers had stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. My phone buzzed on the table, jolting me out of my trance. It was a number I didn't recognize. Answered hesitantly, my voice shaking. Jason, an old neighbor, said, her voice frantic. It's your parents' house, it's burning down. They're saying it started out of nowhere. No one knows how. I dropped the phone. The card was still in my hand, the flames now glowing faintly in the dark. The game had just begun. The phone slipped from my hand, clattering onto the floor. My neighbor's words echoed in my head, your parents' house, it's burning down. My chest tightened, each breath labored as I turned back to the box. The card was glowing faintly, the fire on it flickering as though alive. My hands shook as I reached for it, but the warmth from the card turned into a scalding heat. I dropped it, and it fluttered back into the deck, like nothing had happened. Then the whispers started again, louder this time. They slithered into my ears, overlapping, voices that hissed and murmured incomprehensibly. My room darkened, shadows stretching unnaturally long across the walls. I backed away, my heart pounding, but the box seemed to follow. I shoved it into the closet, slamming the door shut, but as soon as I turned around, it was They're perched on my desk, its lid slightly ajar. The whispers turned into mocking laughter, low and guttural. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flames. My childhood home, swallowed by fire. The screams of something, or someone hidden inside the blaze. By dawn, I couldn't take it anymore. My body moved on its own as I opened the box and pulled. Another card. The whispers fell silent, and the air grew colder. The card depicted a woman standing in a dimly lit hallway. Her face was blurred, her eyes blackened. Something about her image felt wrong, like it didn't belong in this world. As I placed the card down, the lights in my room flickered, and an icy chill crept over my skin. Behind me, the sound of footsteps echoed, slow and deliberate. I froze. The footsteps stopped, but I felt her before I saw her. A heavy presence loomed in the corner of the room, just out of sight. My throat tightened as I forced myself to turn. She was there, at the end of the hallway. Her body was thin, almost skeletal, her head tilted, naturally to one side. Her blackened eyes locked onto mine, hollow and endless. Her face, the same as the one on the card, was clearer now, her mouth trembling as though she wanted to speak. The lights flickered violently, and when the room plunged into darkness, she was gone. My breathing was shallow, my legs trembling as I collapsed onto the chair. I looked back at the card, but it had changed. Her face wasn't blurred anymore. Every detail was vivid: her hollow cheeks, cracked lips, and the deep, dark pits where her eyes should have been. The box whispered again, more urgent now, louder. I tore through my grandmother's belongings, desperate for answers. In a pile of old letters, I found her journal. The entries were frantic, her handwriting jagged and messy, the game traps the souls of the lost. It feeds on fear. It was claimed by my brother. Don't let it claim you. Another entry chilled me to the bone: when their faces appear, it's already too late. They are part of the game now, and so are you. The woman's face stared back at me from the card, unblinking, unrelenting. Somewhere in the house, I heard her voice. It was faint at first, a low, mournful wail that grew louder, filling every shadowed corner of the room. She was coming back. And this time, I wouldn't wake up before she reached me. I woke with a jolt, the damp air choking me before I could even scream. I wasn't in my bed. Around me stretched a dense, twisted forest, the trees impossibly tall, their branches gnarled, like skeletal hands clawing at the sky. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of wet earth and decay. My heart pounded as I turned in a slow circle. It was too dark to see more than a few feet, but something in the shadows moved. Then I saw them, red eyes blinking in the blackness, dozens of them. They didn't move closer, not yet, but I could feel their weight, their intent, pressing down on me like a physical force. A growl rumbled low and deep, vibrating through the ground. My feet sank into the soft, mossy soil as I tried to move. Every step felt like wading through quicksand. The growl turned into a chorus, surrounding me, shaking the trees, the ground, my bones. I ran, or at least tried to. The forest seemed alive, shifting and closing in around me. Branches reached for me, clawing at my clothes, tearing at my skin. My breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air slicing my lungs. Behind me, the glowing eyes moved closer, their whispers turning into guttural, gutted screams. I tripped. My hands sank into the ground, and it was wet, no, sticky. I yanked them back, staring in horror as the darkness revealed it wasn't soil but blood. The screams reached a crescendo, and the eyes surrounded me. I closed my own, bracing for whatever would come. When I opened them again, I was in my bed, drenched in sweat and dirt. My arm stung, scratched and raw. The card was on my nightstand. Its edges were smeared with blood. The air in my room felt colder than before, pressing in on me like a weight. I stared at the card. The forest was gone, replaced by a face I knew too well. It was her. My ex-fiancée, Sophia. Her tear-streaked face stared up at me, her expression frozen in anguish. I hadn't seen her in years, not since the night I walked out. I remembered the look on her face, the way her voice cracked as she begged me to stay. The card burned in my hand as I set it down, but the pain wasn't what made me drop it. Sophia, a voice whispered. My name, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Her voice. I whipped around, my heart slamming against my ribs. The room was empty. The whispers grew. Louder, more insistent, weaving in and out of each other like threads in a nightmare. Then I saw her. A shadow stood at the edge of the room, her figure outlined in the faint glow of the moonlight, spilling through the window. Her face was wrong, twisted with something unnatural, her mouth stretched wide as if screaming, though no sound came out. Sophia, my voice broke as I reached for her. She vanished. The whispers stopped, replaced by a single, blood-curdling scream. It came from the card. Look down. And her face was no longer just anguished, it was mutilated, her mouth contorted into a grin far too wide, her eyes black pits that seemed to stare straight into me. The shadows in the room began to move, curling along the walls like they were alive. The next card slid from the deck on its own, landing face up. It showed a house, my house, and someone was watching me through the window. The shadows began to coalesce, swirling and merging into a single figure. Its form flickered like static on an old television, impossible to focus on but undeniably there. You're running out of time, it hissed, its voice layered with dozens of others, some familiar, some horrifyingly alien. My knees buckled as I stumbled back, hitting the wall. My chest heaved, but I couldn't seem to pull in enough air. The figure moved closer, its form stretching and warping, its edges shifting as though it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Finish the game, it growled, or it will finish you. The deck shuffled itself, the cards flipping and snapping like they were alive. Another card slid out and landed on the floor, face down. The figure pointed at it, its elongated, clawed hand, barely visible in the dim light. With shaking hands, I picked it up. My fingers felt numb as I turned it over. The card was blank. The whispers started again, louder than ever. The figure leaned in, its face, or what should have been its face, coming inches from mine. I could feel its cold breath, hear the low hum of static that seemed to radiate from it. Blank means you don't get to choose, it rasped. And then it was gone. The silence that followed was worse than the whispers. The air was heavy, oppressive, suffocating. I felt the card in my hand begin to pulse, growing colder and colder and colder until I could barely hold onto it. And then, in the corner of the room, a new shadow emerged. Larger this time, darker, more solid, and it was coming for me. The last card slid into my hand, its surface icy cold. I didn't flip it over, I couldn't. My hands were shaking too much, and the air around me felt thick and oppressive. But as I clutched the card, the lights in the room flickered and died, plunging me into complete darkness. The silence was suffocating, broken only by my uneven breathing. Then came the whispers, louder than before, their words distinct for the first time. This is your final chance. When the darkness lifted, I wasn't in my bedroom anymore. I was standing in my grandmother's house, or some warped, decayed version of it. The walls sagged, the wallpaper peeling and long, wet strips. The floor beneath my feet groaned with each hesitant step. Shadows moved at the edges of my vision, always just out of reach, but I could feel them watching me. Hello, my voice was weak, swallowed by the stillness. No one answered, but the shadows seemed to draw closer, pulling me forward. The first room I entered was a sickening replica of the night I left Sophia. The same couch, the same dim lighting, the same anguished look on her face as she begged me to stay. But this time, she wasn't just crying, she was screaming. Her voice tore through the air, filled with rage and despair, her distorted figure writhing as if trapped in the memory. I stumbled backward, but another door opened, leading to the next memory, the homeless man. his body lying limp on a frozen sidewalk, his hollow eyes staring at me in accusation. The shadows grew darker, thicker, pressing against me from every side. I couldn't escape. When I finally drew the last card, its image was blinding a sunrise. The shadows recoiled, their screams echoing in the void as I collapsed, the light burning them away. But as I faded into unconsciousness, one thought lingered: did I really win? I woke up on the floor, drenched in sweat and gasping for air. My room was still, eerily quiet, and bathed in the pale glow of the rising sun. The game was gone, the cards, the box, the shadows, all of it had vanished, leaving no trace. But something was wrong. The air felt heavy, charged with a presence I couldn't see but knew was there. I sat up slowly, my head pounding, my limbs trembling. My eyes darted around the room, searching for movement, for shadows where they shouldn't be. That's when I noticed the mirror. The reflection wasn't mine. It was the woman from the card. Her hollow eyes staring at me, her lips mouthing silent words. I froze as her hands pressed against the glass, the surface rippling like water. I blinked, and she was gone. The relief didn't last. Months passed, and I tried to convince myself it was over. I threw myself into routines, surrounded myself with noise, and avoided silence at all costs. But the whispers returned soft. At first, just faint murmurs in the back of my mind. Then louder, more insistent, until I couldn't escape them. The package arrived on a cold, gray morning. I didn't need to open it to know what it was. The weight of it in my hands told me everything. Still, I tore through the tape, my stomach nodding as the box came into view. It was pristine, the carvings more vivid than before. A single note lay inside, written in the same jagged handwriting I'd seen before. Your turn is over, but the game never ends. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with their guttural cacophony. The box seemed to vibrate, the carvings glowing faintly in the dim light. I knew what it wanted. I'm writing this as a warning. If you ever find this game, don't touch it. Don't open it. And for God's sake, don't play. But if you hear the whispers, it's already too late. Are you sure you're alone right now? Or is something watching, waiting, just outside your line of sight? If you dare, share the story. But remember, every retelling brings it closer to you. The email was short and desperate, pleading for me to meet at the treehouse, but it wasn't the message that froze my blood, it was the sender. My childhood friend had died 5 years ago, buried in a grave I'd stood beside. As I stared at the screen, another email came through. Hurry. It's getting dark. I was working late that night. The hum of my laptop, the only sound in the small apartment. The glow from the screen illuminated the cluttered desk and the empty coffee cup beside me. I'd lost track of time again, buried in endless tasks, when my email notification dinged. It was a small sound, insignificant on most days, but for some reason it sent a chill down my spine. I glanced at the sender's name, and my stomach flipped. Daniel Harper. I blinked, certain I was mistaken. Daniel had been dead for 5 years. My hands hesitated over the keyboard. I clicked the email. The subject line read, "Come to the treehouse." The body of the email was even shorter. It's urgent. Hurry, it's getting dark. My breath caught. I hadn't thought about the treehouse in years. It was where Daniel and I spent our summers, hiding from the world, sharing secrets, and dreaming of adventures. The memories felt warm at first, but they quickly soured as another thought surfaced: the day he died. I slammed my laptop shut, telling myself it was a cruel prank. But then, my laptop dinged again. The second email read, "You promised you'd always come back." The air in the room grew colder. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering in my chest. Hadn't told anyone about that promise. Daniel and I had made it the summer before he died, our hands clasped in a childish pact as we stood in that treehouse. A deep, gnawing guilt crept into me. I had never gone back. Grabbing my keys, I headed for my car. My hometown was only a few hours away. I needed answers, and the treehouse was the only place I could think to find them. The road stretched endlessly before me, the headlights barely cutting through the dense fog that clung to the asphalt. The closer I got to my hometown, the quieter everything seemed. Even the usual hum of the car engine felt muted, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the night. When I pulled up to the woods, the sight of them made my chest tighten. They were darker then. I remembered their towering trees swaying slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. The path leading to the treehouse was overgrown, nearly hidden beneath years of neglect. I parked and stepped out, the crunch of gravel under my boots the only sound. The air was cold, unnaturally so for this time of year. It pressed against my skin, thick and suffocating. Each step down the path felt heavier than the last. The woods seemed to close in around me, the darkness shifting unnaturally as if it were alive. I reached the clearing, and there it was, the treehouse. It stood like a relic of the past, its wood weathered and gray. The ladder dangled precariously, creaking in the stillness. I hesitated, a part of me screaming to turn back, but something, stronger something I couldn't name, pushed me forward. As I climbed, the rickety wood groaned beneath my weight. Halfway up, I felt it a tug on my ankle. I froze, the blood draining from my face. Slowly, I looked down. No one was there. I scrambled up the rest of the ladder, my chest heaving. Inside, the treehouse was exactly as I remembered it, yet it felt wrong. The air was colder, and shadows clung to the corners like cobwebs. Pinned to the wall was an old photograph of Daniel and me. The sight of it sent a wave of nausea through me. I pulled it down, and on the back, written in faded handwriting that could only be Daniel's, were the words, "It wasn't your fault, but it will be." A sharp, cold gust of wind blew through the treehouse, and I turned, half expecting to see someone behind me. But the space was empty, silent until my phone buzzed again. The message read, "Let's play." I sat in the treehouse, staring at the photograph, my chest tightening with every second. My phone buzzed again. I nearly dropped it as I read the new email, "Let's play." Attached were instructions: dig under the treehouse. You'll find the first piece of what we need. I wanted to leave, but something kept me there, a strange, invisible pull. Climbing down the rickety ladder, I felt the air thicken. The cold wrapped around me like icy fingers. Grabbing an old, rusted spade that lay nearby, I started to dig. The soil was damp, heavier than I remembered. Each scoop brought a faint sound like whispers, but muffled and distant. I tried to ignore them, but the sound grew louder, rhythmic, like a heartbeat in the ground. Then my spade struck something solid. My breath hitched. I unearthed the small tin box, its edges crusted with dirt and rust. Opening it felt wrong, like prying open a wound, but I couldn't stop myself. Inside were things I recognized: a marble we'd played with as kids, a broken slingshot, and pocket knife. Its blade was stained, the rusted color unmistakable. Blood. The whispers exploded into screams. I spun around, searching the dark forest, but nothing was there, or so I thought. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, just barely visible. "Daniel," I called, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its stare. My phone buzzed again. Another email popped up. The subject line, "You're next." The figure was gone. Clutching the tin box, I climbed back into the treehouse, my hands trembling. Inside, another message awaited me on the wall: "The first step is done. Now it begins." The treehouse felt smaller, its walls pressing in like it was alive. The air was heavy, and every breath felt like dragging my lungs through water. My phone buzzed again, the glow of the screen piercing the darkness. Another email. "To, you've opened the box. Now open the truth." The treehouse groaned, the wooden planks shifting beneath me. I scanned the walls, searching for anything that might explain the messages. That's when I noticed a faint carving near the corner. It wasn't there before. I moved closer. Running my fingers over the jagged letters helped me. The wood was warm, almost pulsing under my touch. Suddenly, the floorboards creaked behind me. I turned so fast I nearly fell, but no one was there. The whispers began again, louder, encircling me. They weren't random this time. They were calling my name. The treehouse felt colder, but my body was slick with sweat. My phone buzzed again, and this time the subject line read, "Look behind you." I froze, my stomach twisting into knots. Slowly, I turned my head. Daniel was there. Bahir. He stood in the corner, his clothes soaked and muddy, his head tilted unnaturally to one side. His eyes hollow. Black pits seemed to burn into me. Daniel, my voice barely escaped. He didn't answer. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Then, like a flicker of a dying light bulb, he was gone. My phone vibrated in my hand, jolting me. The message on the screen wasn't from Daniel this time. It was written in red, dripping text that looked like blood. "Finish the game, or you'll join him." The photograph on the wall shifted, the image warping until Daniel's face was no longer smiling. He was screaming. The photograph wouldn't stop shifting. Daniel's face twisted, the smile warping into a scream. Tore my eyes away, but the image lingered, etched into my mind like a brand. My phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look, but something compelled me. The message was, "Short, go back to the river." I froze. The river. The place where Daniel had drowned. My stomach churned as a memory clawed its way to the surface the last time I saw him. I didn't walk to the river. My legs felt like they moved on their own, dragging me through the dark forest. The path was overgrown, the trees closing in like they didn't want me to leave. The whispers followed me, growing louder with every step. When I reached the water's edge, the moonlight reflected off its surface, casting an eerie glow. But the river wasn't calm. The water churned violently, splashing as if something or someone was thrashing beneath the surface. "Daniel," my voice broke as I stumbled closer. The thrashing stopped. The water stilled, unnaturally calm. Then, slowly, something began to rise. At first, it was just hair, wet and clinging to a pale face. Then the eyes appeared, black and hollow, staring straight at me. "You left me," Daniel's voice rasped, though his mouth didn't move. "I didn't mean to," I stammered, stepping back, but the ground beneath my feet softened, pulling me closer to the water. "You knew what would happen," he hissed, his voice mixing with the rushing water. "You left me to drown." The whispers turned to screams as hands, dozens of them, reached out from the river, clawing at the banks. I tried to run, but the mud held me fast. As the first icy hand grabbed my ankle, my phone buzzed. The message read, "Confess." The icy hand dragged me toward the water. I kicked and clawed at the ground, but the mud seemed alive, swallowing my legs inch by inch. My screams echoed through the forest, but no one was there to hear them. Another buzz from my phone. I snatched it from my pocket with trembling hands. The screen glowed with a single word, "Confess." "I'm sorry," I yelled, my voice cracking. "I didn't mean to leave you. I was scared." The hands froze, their grip loosening slightly, but the water began to ripple again. Daniel's face reappeared, his expression contorted with rage and sorrow. His voice slithered into my ears, low and guttural. "You didn't just leave me," he hissed. "You knew what," I shouted. The mud pulled me deeper, now up to my thighs. The water churned violently as Daniel's form rose higher, his eyes burning black holes into my soul. "You knew I wouldn't make it back," he said, his voice overlapping with dozens of others, each one accusing, each one broken. "You left me to die. You chose yourself." My chest heaved as fragmented memories flashed through my mind, Daniel calling my name. The river's edge slick and dangerous, my feet stumbling backward as fear overtook me. "I didn't push you," I cried, but you didn't help." The words struck me like a physical blow. I felt the truth in them, the weight of my guilt crushing my chest. The hands released me suddenly, and I stumbled backward onto solid ground. The water calmed, Daniel's figure sinking slowly into the depths. But the whispers didn't stop. They surrounded me, growing louder, turning into laughter low, guttural, and inhuman. My phone buzzed again. The message read one last task. Woke sprawled on the forest floor, the damp earth clinging to my skin. The air was bitterly cold. But the sweat dripping down my face burned like fire. Above me, the treehouse loomed silently, its weathered boards swaying gently in the windless night. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then I noticed my phone lying beside me, its screen lit with a new message. "You've made your choice. Now let's see if they'll make theirs." I staggered to my feet, every muscle aching, and stumbled toward my car. The forest felt alive. The trees leaning closer, the darkness pressing against my back. When I reached the road, I didn't look back. At the hotel, the fluorescent lights felt too bright, too harsh, as I locked the door behind me. The room felt wrong, smaller somehow, and no matter how many times I glanced at the mirror, couldn't shake the feeling that my reflection was watching me. I opened my laptop, desperate for clarity, desperate for anything to make sense. But as the screen came to life, I saw it the email I'd been avoiding. The cursor blinked in the reply box, waiting for me to act. Send it. The words appeared on the screen without me typing them. My heart sank as I realized what had to be done. The only way to escape the whispers, the shadows, the never-ending pull of the treehouse. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling. "Hey, it's Alex. Do you remember the treehouse? I need you to meet me there. It's urgent." As soon as I hit send, the room fell silent. Too silent. I glanced at the mirror again, and this time, my reflection wasn't there. "Are you sure the screen you're staring at is still safe? Or has the treehouse already found a way through? If this story chills you, share it, but beware, every retelling brings the curse closer to your world." The image he showed me wasn't from his imagination, it was from his memory. At first I thought it was just a child's attempt at drawing something scary. But as I looked closer, the details became disturbingly familiar. He shouldn't have known about the things in that picture, because only I had seen them before. That's when I realized his nightmare wasn't just it was ours. It had been years since I'd seen him. The kind of years that distance you from the past, making old memories feel like distant dreams. And yet, when Alex reached out to me out of the blue, something in my chest tightened, an instinct, perhaps reminding me of things I hadn't wanted to remember. We hadn't spoken in so long. His message was simple: "I need to show you something. I think you'll recognize it." When we met, his eyes were wide and unsettled. His hands trembled as he handed me the drawing. It was just a child's drawing at first glance. A jumble of squiggly lines, dark shadows, and something wrong. I half smiled, wondering if he'd just discovered his love for spooky doodles, maybe working through childhood nightmares. But then, something caught me off guard: the shape of the shadow in the corner. A dark, twisted shape. The place was familiar. I couldn't place it at first, but it gnawed at me, scratching at the back of my mind, like a whisper that I couldn't ignore. My fingers hovered over the drawing, my breath catching in my throat. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but then I saw it again. The gnarled tree in the corner, the way it curved, like an arm reaching out to grab, and the shadow that twisted inhumanly, like it was waiting, watching. I looked at Alex, his eyes now frantic, desperate. I saw it, in my dreams. I saw this thing, this place, he muttered, voice cracking. You remember, don't you?" A cold chill crept down my spine as I stared at the drawing. Of course I remembered. How could I not? That treehouse. That damn treehouse. The one I thought I had buried long ago. But it wasn't the image that made my heart race, it was the feeling. that knot in my stomach, as if the drawing had reached into my soul and pulled out a memory I'd kept buried. I'd been there, as a child, but I hadn't spoken about it in years, couldn't speak of it without my pulse racing, without the haunting thought that something still lurked there, in the shadows, waiting. How could Alex know about this? How could he remember it too? My breath felt like ice in my chest, every inhale trembling. Alex, this is impossible, I whispered, my eyes tracing the details again. I could feel the room growing colder, the air thickening. Where did you see this? How do you? But before I could finish my sentence, the picture seemed to move. The shadow in the drawing shifted, stretching unnaturally. I blinked, and it was as if the air around me warped. My hand shook as I pointed to the corner. This is where I was, Alex. I was there. We were both there. His eyes grew wide with terror. I know, he cried, grabbing my arm, his grip icy. I saw it, too. It's like it's inside me now. It's not just my nightmare. It's ours. I shook my head, my heart pounding, as I felt the dark weight of our shared past rising, and rising like the memory of that place we had both forgotten, or tried to. I had escaped, or so I thought. But now, as I stared at the drawing, I realized that whatever dark force had haunted us as children was returning. And this time, it wasn't just in my mind. It was real. It was coming for us both. Kind to. The shadows in the picture seemed to pulse now, alive, almost eager. And somewhere deep, within, I could feel it. It was waiting. I could feel the pull of that place again, tugging at me. The nightmare wasn't just a dream. It was alive. I couldn't stop shaking as I stood up, the drawing still in my hands. My throat was dry, my mouth too tight to speak. But I knew one thing: this couldn't be a coincidence. That treehouse, that shadowy memory that had been buried for so long. It was too real, too familiar. It had been years since I last stood beneath its crooked, rotting wooden steps, but I felt the same cold rush in my veins now that I did back then. And I wasn't the only one. Alex was staring at me, his face pale, eyes wide, as if he were hearing the same thing I was: the sound of footsteps, creaking, wood, whispering voices. We have to go there, I said, almost to myself. My voice cracked, but I couldn't stop. The pull was too strong. I didn't even look at Alex as I turned toward the door. I didn't need to see his face to know he was already behind me, drawn in by the same force, the same unspeakable need to face whatever had tormented us both for so long. We made our way through the overgrown woods, the path barely visible beneath the thick, tangled roots. The air was unnaturally still, like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting. Every crack of a twig, every rustling leaf sent a jolt of panic through my chest. The closer we got to the treehouse, the more I could feel someone watching us. When we reached the clearing, the treehouse loomed in front of us, decayed and abandoned. Just as I remembered. But something was wrong. The air was thicker here, suffocating. The once vibrant trees that surrounded the house now seemed twisted and dead, their limbs reaching out like claws. And there, in the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a shadow flicker, a movement too fast to be human, too wrong to be anything real. Alex stepped forward, his breath shallow. I never wanted to come back here, he muttered. I thought if I ignored it, if I forgot, it would all go away. But it wasn't going anywhere. I could feel it in my bones, in the tremor of the earth beneath my feet. Something was awake, and it was waiting. I took a shaky step towards the ladder. Every part of me screamed to turn around, to run, but I couldn't. We had to know. We had to find out why this nightmare was so much more than just a dream. When Alex followed me up, I could hear his breath catching with each step, each creak of the old wood beneath our feet. But we kept climbing, until we finally reached the top. The treehouse was just as I remembered it: broken windows, splintered walls, but now Something else was there. The air was thick with a presence, something dark and heavy, like it was suffocating the very space we stood in. I walked inside, my hands trembling. The dusty floorboards groaned underfoot. And then I saw it, the mark. A deep gouge in the wood, a symbol I didn't recognize, but somehow I knew it. It had been there before. "Do you remember this?" I whispered to Alex, my voice barely audible. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned to the corner of the room, his face going pale. His hand shot out, pointing. There, etched into the wall, was something alive, a shape shifting, flickering, in and out of focus, like something that didn't belong. A twisted figure, black as ink, its limbs long and jagged, stretching toward us. And then, the whispers started. Quiet at first, like a low murmur carried on the wind, but they grew louder, clearer, until they filled my head with an agonizing pressure. The words were unintelligible, but the fear they invoked was overwhelming, suffocating. Alex grabbed my arm, his grip iron tight. "We shouldn't have come back," he choked out, but he didn't answer. The shadows were closing in now, not just around us, but within us, circling, pulling us back into that nightmare we had both tried to forget. I knew then the nightmare was never just a memory. It was a doorway, and we had walked right through it. The air grew colder, the whispers more insistent. And then, the floor creaked behind me. I turned, heart hammering, and saw the last thing I expected, the door slowly creaking open. A figure standing in the threshold. A tall, gaunt silhouette, its face obscured, but its eyes glowing, faintly, like the faintest embers of a dying fire. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, the figure stepped forward, and everything went dark. The figure stepped forward, its shape becoming clearer as it moved closer, too close. The air seemed to thicken with every inch it gained, the shadows stretching impossibly long, curling like claws around us. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The ground beneath me felt as though it had turned to stone, freezing me in place. Alex stumbled back, his face drained of color, his eyes wide with fear. It's here. It came for us. It was never just a nightmare." His voice cracked, barely more than a breath. But I could feel it, the suffocating presence, the weight of its stare. It wasn't just watching. It was waiting for us. To react, to fight back, to beg. The figure tilted its head, an unnatural movement, like a puppet jerked by invisible strings. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was hollow. A twisted mask of shadows, shifting in and out of shape, the edges blurring, as though it was made of the very darkness around us. I could feel the chill crawling up my spine, my breath stalling in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but the terror had already gripped me, chained me to the floor. "Alex, we have to leave," I whispered, the words barely forming in my mouth. But I didn't believe them. I knew, deep down, that we couldn't leave. This thing, whatever it was the treehouse. It was tied to it, to everything we had experienced. He nodded, but his eyes were distant, unfocused. His mind, it seemed, was slipping further away, lost to something that hadn't just haunted us in dreams. This was real. The evil we had run from, buried so deep inside, had come back to claim us. The creature stepped forward again, this time reaching out a hand, long, thin fingers that stretched unnaturally, their tips brushing against the wooden frame of the treehouse. It felt like it was pulling at the very air around us, drawing life from the room. I could hear it now, the whispers, low and guttural, a language I couldn't understand but knew in my bones was never meant for human ears. Suddenly, the floor beneath us cracked, splitting with a deafening sound. Alex screamed, and I grabbed his arm, pulling him away, but the crack only grew wider, deeper. The treehouse groaned in protest, its wooden bones creaking as if it, too, was alive and suffering. And then, from the depths of that darkness, I saw it, the symbol we had both forgotten, now burned into the floor beneath us. The same mark from the drawing, It wasn't a coincidence. This place, this nightmare, it was alive. We thought it was over. We thought the nightmare had finally loosened its grip. But as the last remnants of the creature's presence seemed to vanish, something else lingered, something darker, deeper. The air in the treehouse was still suffocating, but I could feel it. Something was wrong. My hand trembled as I stood over the spot where the symbol had been, the place we'd pressed our palms in a desperate attempt to end this nightmare. But the floor was still warm, not just the warmth of wood, but something far more unnatural, like the heat of a living thing. And then, a soft, scraping noise filled the silence like fingernails dragging across stone, slow, deliberate, close. I turned, expecting nothing, but then I saw it. The corner of the room that had once been empty, a shape now stood there, its outline faint but unmistakable. It wasn't the creature. No. This was something different, something older, something that had been waiting. A figure, hunched, its long fingers pressed against the wall, as if it had always been there, watching us. Before I could react, I heard Alex's voice behind me. It was barely a whisper, but it was enough to freeze me in place. It's not over. It's never over. I spun around, but when I looked at him, it was like he wasn't there anymore. His eyes were wide, empty, like they weren't his own. The familiar, frantic panic had drained from his face, replaced by a hollow, empty expression. He opened his mouth to speak, but what came out wasn't his voice. It will never let you go. His mouth twisted into something wrong, something unnatural. He reached out, his arm, extending like a dark, twisted branch, fingers stretching far too long, his skin pale and taut, and then, with a soft gasp, Alex crumpled, falling to the floor in a heap, motionless. I felt my heart stop, terror clutching at my throat. But as I backed away from him, my eyes caught the faintest movement in the shadows behind me. A whisper brushed my ear, a voice, so close it was almost inside my skull. You're next. The world around me seemed to collapse, the walls shaking, the air thickening, as though the house itself was alive, drawing me in, pulling me under. My legs trembled, but I couldn't move. My breath came in ragged gasps, but no matter how I tried to scream, my voice caught in my throat. I could feel it. It was waiting, lurking in the shadows, its eyes fixed on me, its presence. So close it felt like it was inside me. And then, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, behind me, each one closer than the last. I dared to glance over my shoulder one last time, but there was nothing there. Only darkness, and the whispering. The voices, too many to count, filling my mind. It's only just begun. The treehouse groaned. The shadows pressed in from every angle, the walls closing in, and as I struggled for a breath, I realized with sickening clarity that I could never leave. This place, this nightmare, was a part of me now. It had always been. It had always been waiting. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if it had ever truly been over. If you dare, share this story, but be warned. Every retelling brings it closer to reality. Are you sure you're alone as you finish this story? Or is something watching from the shadows?